Welcome to the podcast where mental health is at the core of what we focus on. We strive to develop people like you to maximize who you are and what you've been called to do by sharing tools and resources for better brain health. And now here's your host, Juan Garcia.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks again for taking out the time to watch, listen to this episode. Today is going to be a fun one as we always have mindfulness of mental health. We want to focus on mental health, which equals brain health. Because remember, we always say that the mind and the brain are separate but inseparable, meaning that our brain affects our mind, which is our thought process, but our mind, our thought process also affects our brain. And so we want to make sure that this relationship that exists is always healthy. And one of the areas that I find, especially in today's very heightened emotional society, where it comes to stereotypes, biases, and judgments, I see that there's this topic that I feel we need to really discuss, which is unconscious bias. If you watched our last episode regarding the amygdala and how it tries to hijack how we respond to certain situations, whether it's in fear and so it flees, or whether the fear causes it to want to fight and it's in survival mode. You will understand that this is a real thing. This is in our brain and it affects our thought process. And the same thing is true. Our thought process affects our brain. And so immediately it kicks in and it wants to take some type of action. And as you and I know, and if we're honest, it's not always the best action. It sometimes actually gets us in trouble. And so I wanted to do a separate episode on this unconscious bias topic because I believe it's pertinent to not only what we're going through today, but it's going to help us in life in general, because we all have biases. We all have biases. And another word for a bias is just a stereotype. We have preferences. We have things that we either grew up believing and preferring in life, and then we also have things that we were taught, our environment and the people that we've surrounded ourselves with kind of instilled in us, and we've accepted and we've believed, and it's part of who we are. And so some of those things are actually unconscious, that they're there. We don't realize necessarily that they're there. So I want to start by defining this phrase, unconscious bias. And a very simple and practical definition of this term, I'll just read it to you. It is, unconscious biases are learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, deeply ingrained, universal, and able to influence behavior. They are learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, deeply ingrained, universal, and able to influence behavior. And this is why it's important, because it has the capacity to not only be ingrained in us, but to affect how we behave, how we respond to people and different circumstances. So I feel that it is necessary for us to realize that we all have that. We all have unconscious biases. And we also have conscious biases, which are those stereotypes that we have elected to have. That, for example, depending on your culture, depending on how you were raised or brought up, you have a preference in the type of food that you eat. You like certain types of food, styles of food, the way they're cooked, etc. That is a conscious bias. And sometimes we have it and we compare to people that have a different type of food preference. And we can match or compare how it affects them opposed to how it affects us, and vice versa. That's a conscious bias. We know, for example, if I'm a vegetarian and I am with someone that is a meat lover or a carnivore, there may be some comparisons that we may do or make, whether it's our health, whether it's how it affects us emotionally, whether how it affects us, how we feel, etc. physically, we do that, but that's a conscious bias. I prefer this over that. I consciously do that. I want to focus this episode on unconscious biases, which are those things that we have that, which is, I want to make sure that I focus on this word. They're unintentional. They're there. They're unintentional. We live by the code, so to speak, and we move around and be within these biases, but we don't know, or we don't intend to do harm or hold them against people or people groups or things. We just have to be aware that we have them. And the only way that we can do that is by having the conversation, defining the term. And also in this episode, I hope that we can also give you tools to kind of unwrap, if you will, these things that are real, that are biases that exist in us. And so one thing that's very important for us to note, that our brain, every day, every moment, our brain takes shortcuts all day to make sure of certain things. For example, when we meet someone, or when we meet people, when we come across certain people, immediately our brain, thousands and millions of times a day, it also takes note of our personal experiences with either that people group or those people that we are encountering with. It also takes into consideration societal norms or stereotypes. Those are all elements that affect some of the biases that we have that are unconscious. Also cultural context, whether it is something that's acceptable or something that is not acceptable in culture. These are different elements that our brain is hardwired to process in nanoseconds when we come in a proximity of a person, a people group, a subject, situations, whatever you want to encompass in that. These are things that our brain has to do, has to process. And because it's so much, we don't have time to actually do specific things in order to not allow the brain to do that. That's our normative functioning brain. It's a healthy brain. That's what it does. And so because of that, there are unconscious biases that we already have in order to make the right decision and make the right response, or have the best behavior for the circumstances or situations that we find ourselves in with people groups or our specific people, etc. So just to summarize, there are unconscious biases that are in us, and our brain every day, every moment takes shortcuts to determine how we are going to respond or behave in the different scenarios that we find ourselves in. And a few of the ways that it does that is that it depends, or it goes back to our background. It uses our personal experiences. It also does a comparison to the societal stereotypes, as well as cultural context, or what is normative within our culture and within our context. So track with me, because I'm going to give you scenarios that will help make sense out of some of these examples that we face every day. So if you will, go with me and visualize this small little story that I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to have some questions for you. Okay? So picture that you are late for a flight and you're running through the airport. And as you get to your gate, you are greeted by the pilot that comes out of the cockpit and says hello to you. You're on your flight, you land, you have a layover at another airport, you grab something to eat, and as you're sitting down waiting for your order, you see a couple that's celebrating an anniversary. You have a good time in your meal, you board your next flight, you arrive at the city that you were destined to go. The next day you have an event that you have to be at. And in this event, this celebrity, someone that you are obviously looking forward to hearing of, is at this event, and you have a great time. Now, if you have visualized with me this story, these are the questions that I want to ask you, and the answer is either a yes or a no. As you were running through the airport and you arrived at the gate and the pilot greeted you, question number one, was the pilot black? Was the pilot a female? Okay. When you went to eat at the layover airport and you saw a couple that was celebrating their anniversary, was that couple an older couple? Was it a younger couple? Was it a white couple? Was it a Latino couple? Was it a biracial mixed couple? Next question, when you get to the event and you experience this celebrity that you were hoping to hear from, was that celebrity a female? Was it a male? Was that celebrity young? Was he or she older? You see, the answer to all of those questions and the visualization that you had through this process is your own unconscious biases. We all have them. Those are preferences because of our background, because of our personal experiences, because of the society's stereotypes that we've been experienced or exposed to, and also the cultural context, if we prefer music in the genres hip hop, jazz, classical, or if we prefer movies, TV shows, actors and actresses, etc. Those are the things that affect our judgment calls that then also affect our behavior. And that's where we have to be cautious, because we cannot escape them. They are unconscious. They're there and they exist for a reason. And so we have to pay attention to them and be mindful that we also can take advantage of the understanding that we have of it so that we can make better decisions as we go along. Now, I personally can be at an advantage to some people because I travel quite a bit. And so I've been in different contexts, cultural, societal, religious. I've been in many contexts with much diversity where, for example, the work that I do, I'm in hospitals a lot. And because of that, and I'm in different parts of the country in different types of hospitals, mostly in ICUs. And when people are sick, when, for example, I get a call to respond to a patient and the family that is enduring the hardship of unhealth and situations that I have to go and help this family grieving, and also do assessments and evaluations on brain damage or brain death. The scenarios are all diverse, from dynamics in the family that are unknown to me to dynamics in the family that I am very well aware of personally, to situations where there's an expectation, good or bad, indifferent, and the opposite is there for you to experience. So many things that I've been able to experience in the last few years in the work that I do. And so that has given me more of a material that will counter my own unconscious biases. So if I had certain biases that I wasn't aware of until I experienced these different situations, whether it's at hospitals or whether it's with clients that I've been working with or patients. Then all of a sudden those biases come to the front of my consciousness. I'm aware of them, and now I have a decision to make. Do I keep this bias? Is this bias healthy for me? Or is it affecting my positive or healthy perspective of people as a whole? Those are the tough questions that we have to answer ourselves, because if we don't, or if our answer to that is yes or no, depending on how we ask ourselves and how real we want to be, then we can be in a place where we're not benefiting from the experiences of life that make us better. I believe that we experience certain things in life, and we have the opportunity to choose to be better because of those experiences. I don't believe in the victim mentality. I don't believe in victimhood, although we can be on the negative end or unhealthy end of things that may have happened to us. I don't believe that we need to necessarily receive or accept the role of victimhood. We can get those experiences, which I've been a part of, and say, what can I learn from this experience, and how has it made me better because of it? Because at the end of the day, I'm here, I'm alive, I made it, so I am a victor. I am not a victim. And so that affects how I think about circumstances, the situation, and being optimistic about why that has happened to me and the purpose behind it. Another thing that I want to address is this issue of how do we look at these biases, these unconscious biases, and work towards making them or having them be positive in our lives, or switching them, if you will. So one of the things that I can say is we need to visualize. We need to visualize, as we did in the story, okay, why did I choose that particular gender or race when the story of being greeted by the pilot was mentioned? Why did I pick that particular race, age of the couple that was celebrating the anniversary? Why did I pick the celebrity or celebrities that I did when the story had to do with the event? Why? What is behind the reason? Now, obviously, we have a background, we have our personal experiences, we have society, we have culture. All of those are influencers. But now we have to ask ourselves, why? Why did we go there, right? And secondly, examine. Examine, is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? And thirdly, normalize it. It could be that we have some type of agreement towards that choice that we made, whether we feel that all teachers that we experience are female, right? If you think about a teacher, you probably first think of a female teacher. Or if you're a woman, you may think of a male teacher that you had, right? Or you would think of a mean teacher, or you would think of a pleasant teacher. Those are things that we go to because of our experiences. And so what I'm asking is try to normalize it. In other words, don't make what's negative something that you justify or that it's allowed, that it's right. No, you say, well, this is how that person was. That doesn't mean that every teacher is like that. Hope that makes sense. And so what I'll do is, in the description of this episode, I'll post some links of different resources that will help give you more of the images and the things that describe the unconscious biases a little better if you need to read a material that you want to go over. But there is actual research that shows that the MRIs that are done in brains can actually measure unconscious biases. So this is fascinating. This is something that's measurable. It's real. It's not some thing that somebody's put together and kind of sounds great or interesting. This is real. This is in our brain. So I want you to take note of that. Now, here's the question that I want to leave you with. How do you tackle the influence that unconscious bias has? How do you go about dealing with this whole reality of unconscious bias? Well, number one, become more aware. There are different types of biases within our the awareness of our unconscious biases that we have to know. For example, we have what's called a like me bias, meaning I am biased towards certain people because I feel that they're a lot like me. I relate to them, and so I have a positive bias towards people that are like me, in my opinion. There's also this bias of confidential bias, where I feel that I can trust this person because they remind me of something that's trustworthy. There's also this bias that's called anchor bias. And anchor bias is that I trust the first information that I receive about something. And so if I read an article and it tells me that this is good for a specific category, that's the article I go to, and that's an anchor bias. And so if someone else brings information that is either contrary or different than what I've read, I automatically go on defense mode and I automatically try to argue how wrong they are. So these are biases that we have to be aware of. If you have a specific expression of faith, for example, I consider myself a follower of Jesus. I don't like the term Christian. Number one, it's not in the Bible. Number two, everybody says that they're Christian nowadays. And so I want to be specific and say that I am a follower of Jesus, or at least that's my goal, being imperfect. And in that pursuit of being a follower of Jesus, there are certain expressions of faith that I subscribe to, disciplines, spiritual disciplines that I subscribe to. And so if someone comes with a different aspect of what that is supposed to look like, I have to consider that they may have that information based on an anchor bias that they have. They grew up in a certain context, cultural context, societal context. They grew up in a certain familial context, a different part of the country, the world, etc. Those are things that now, not only do I have to be aware of my own unconscious bias, but I have to keep in mind their unconscious bias. It's a potential to influence the conversation and how we go about it. Okay, so we have to be aware. Number two, we have to find our triggers. When does this happen in us? When is it that we are ultimately flowing in an unconscious bias way? What are the things that are happening around us or at us or to us that trigger these unconscious biases to come to fruition, if you will? Number three, how do we tackle this? Well, we need to take deep breaths. Now, if you've been listening to our podcast and different episodes, you've probably heard this before. We talked about the amygdala and how it helps to take deep breaths. And we talked about, well, listen to that episode. I think it'll help you understand a little better if you haven't. But we talked about deep breaths, the importance, the health behind it. And as it pertains to unconscious bias, what it does is it helps us slow down. It helps us take a break. And in our society today, let me tell you, this is difficult. This is difficult. I don't know how many people I've been able to come into contact with, whether in a professional, mental health category or friendship, family. It is difficult more and more for people to find themselves in a quiet space, meaning shutting down all types of devices, putting aside or taking some time to be by themselves and in themselves to either pray, meditate, or just journal. I think it's so healthy for us to either at the end of the day or first thing in the morning to journal and write out how we're feeling, how we're processing, what's affecting us, how we viewed something specific that happened, how we are viewing something that we're anticipating. All of these things are important, and it gives us the time to breathe, to slow down and reflect. If you are in my age category and higher, you probably grew up without internet. I grew up without the internet. I grew up without cell phones. I grew up without any of that technology. I mean, having a computer was luxury. And at the time when I was growing up, it was a Tandy computer. It was huge, it was heavy. And so the only computers that I was exposed to were those that ultimately I was able to see in high school. And a cell phone was something that you only saw in movies. And growing up that way, it forced us to either go to the local library in the town or the one in the high school when we were in high school, or if we were fortunate enough to have an Encyclopedia Britannica, we would have to literally open it up, look for the information, park there, write notes, make copies if we have access to a copy machine at the library or somewhere, someone's office, and literally ingrain ourselves into this information so that we were well equipped or ill-equipped, or well equipped rather, for either being tested in it or just for our own knowledge base. We weren't exposed to this, quick fix, quick answer, instant gratification thing that we find today. For example, right now, if you're listening or watching this and you have access to some internet device or web browser, you can quickly Google everything that I'm saying, and immediately you'll get responses and answers and hundreds of pages of information that's out there. But that doesn't mean that you actually know the information, because it takes time to slow down and actually stay in the moment, be mindful of what you're doing so that it can be ingrained in your thought process. And your brain actually then stores it so that you can retrieve it when you need to access that information in the future. So it's a different time that we live in, and people have a very hard time slowing down. And this is the time where we have so much resource. We have obviously internet, we have podcasts, we have books that are audiobooks, we have yoga, we have meditation, we have exercise, we have home gyms, we have apps galore. We have access to all these things, and for some reason society has convinced us as a culture that we don't have time to slow down. That is not true, and it's unhealthy. We need to slow down, review, reflect, process, because this is going to help us identify not only our unconscious biases, but where they come from and how we can combat it if it's unhealthy. Now, keep in mind, there are unconscious biases that are actually healthy, whether we remember how we picked them up or not. If they're healthy, amen, let's continue to practice and be led by them. But if they're unhealthy, which is the focus of this episode, if they're unhealthy, let's identify them. Let's see what's triggering them. Let's slow down, and then the fourth step, let's do something different. So if I find myself in a situation where an unconscious bias comes to the forefront of this situation, and I've done all of these things, I've tried to become aware of it, I've figured out the trigger, and I've slowed down and taken deep breaths to kind of take it all in, and then now I have an opportunity to do something different. It could be having more conversations, intentional conversations about a specific topic, a religion, outside of the box. Well, I always like to say that there is no box, but for those of you that have accepted the fact that there is a box, think outside that box and do something different to counteract your unconscious bias. Again, if it's unhealthy, and begin to understand how we can develop good biases, because biases are not evil or wrong. That's up to the individual to determine what we do with it. Biases are there to protect us, to keep us safe, to keep us aware. It's what we do with those biases that will then determine whether it's evil as we act upon them, or as we mistreat people, as we identify people for, or we put them in a category, because that is what unconscious biases do. They give us the ability, whether it's good or bad, to categorize people in different social constructs, and that's how we relate to people best. So that's why it's important to understand this, because sometimes we categorize people in places where they don't belong, number one. Number two, where we're totally wrong about it. And number three, where we don't treat them right because of the category that we've given them. And ultimately, those categories are wrong. So it's important to be aware of this. Super important to be aware of our unconscious biases. There's an election year. We're dealing with protesters. We're dealing with social injustice. We're dealing with social unrest. We're dealing with COVID-19 and the ramifications of having to wear masks and changing the way we become who we are as an American society. All of these things are compounded and has given us stress levels that we probably have never experienced in our life. And so now is the time to be more and more open-minded to the possibilities of unconscious biases that are not healthy. That we're doing these things unconsciously, and we have the power to turn that around so that our biases are positive, are conscious, and are also healthy, so we can associate ourselves with people in loving kindness, with grace, with mercy, with empathy, understanding that we're all humans and we're all in this together. Whether we see it or not, we're in this place called Earth, planet Earth. We've been created with a purpose. There's a higher calling. We have to be accountable for that. And so let's love each other through this process in grace and in truth, and understanding that we all have potential. We all have something to give and provide into this world, because we've all been created with a purpose. So that's unconscious bias. So don't put me in any category now. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Please, please, please subscribe. Let people know that we are trying to help with mental health, bringing awareness. We're trying to help people understand how we're wired and how that affects our brain health, and also how our brain health affects our mindset. This is so important. That's why we've come to you with this podcast, so that we can help you along the way. So don't forget to share. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast. For more information, visit our website at juangarciaenterprises.com. Our host, Juan Garcia, is available for speaking, coaching, and one-on-one counseling. You can email us at info@juangarciaenterprises.com. Until next time, remember, we only have one mind, so mind yours.